right, good morning. Good to see everyone here. We were getting started up there with a song called Sweet Home Alabama. Came out in 1974 with the band Lynyrd Skynyrd, and it is a continuation of the conversation that we started on Tuesday about the meaning of the 1960s and 1970s, and it's sort of a musical rejoinder to some of what we heard last week. Specifically, it was a response to a couple of Neil Young songs, one of which was called Southern Man, which was very critical of the South, sort of protest anthems, civil rights anthems. You could also think of it as a rejoinder to the Nina Simone song that we heard last Tuesday, Mississippi Goddam. Well, now we have Sweet Home Alabama. And so that is our entry point into what we're going to be talking about today, which is once again the 60s and 70s. But on Tuesday, we looked at liberals and the left and the rise of the civil rights movement and the protest culture of the 1960s and 70s. And today, we are going to sort of tell the other side of that story, look at the rise of the modern right as it took root in the 50s and 60s in what comes to be self-described as a conservative movement. We're going to then look at the late 60s into the 70s and the significance of a politician who was controversial at the time, remains controversial today, Richard Nixon. And then we're going to finish up looking at the rise of Ronald Reagan as a political figure, and really as a figure who came to embody both the conservative movement of which he had been a part since the 1950s, and also a transformation of the Republican Party. Last week, we talked about the ways in which the Democratic Party is changing and becoming a party that's much more committed to not only a set of liberal principles, but to the cause of civil rights, and the ways that that started to change the Democratic coalition. Well, we're going to talk about the Republican side of that story today. But as we start out, I want to mention a few things that I think both the left and the right had in common in the 1960s and 70s, at least a common set of questions and to some degree a common set of solutions. We're going to see many ways in which they differed, particularly on questions about the role and size of the federal government in its relationship not only to the economy but to ordinary citizens' lives. They differed deeply around the question of civil rights, but there were a couple of questions that they really had in common. One is that the right, like the left, is engaging in the great problem, so said, of the 50s and 60s, which is the problem of affluence. And asking, is this modern consumer society actually a society that has meaning and connection and purpose? We saw the left talking about that, and we're going to see the right as well. They had a common set of historical reference points. In many ways, the modern right is born out of the reaction to the New Deal, but of course, World War II and especially the Cold War are central points of reference. Varieties of anti-communism are all over American politics, but really central to right-wing and conservative politics from the 1940s onward. And like some of the people we saw on Tuesday, they are also engaged in telling a story about American history, looking at the centennial of the Civil War, looking at the bicentennial that's coming along in 1976, and engaging in a set of debates and interventions about where exactly the nation stands in history. And then finally, both sides of this debate in the 1960s have to some degree a common diagnosis of what has actually gone wrong in American politics. And it's a diagnosis that will sound, I think, perhaps very strange to people today. But their diagnosis, coming from the left as well as from the right, is that the American political parties were too much alike. They agreed on too many things. They all got together on too too many pieces of legislation. For liberals and leftists, it was the Democratic Party, which has this huge conservative constituency in the middle of it, primarily but not exclusively the white South. And for conservatives who are looking at the Republican Party as their vehicle, their critique is that the Republican Party has basically become liberalism light, that figures like Eisenhower are too much within the world of the New Deal and the Great Society, and that there is no outlet for conservative politics. And so many people in American society decide that the thing that's going to really fix American democracy is to have two distinctive ideological parties that don't agree on things, to give people a real choice. And it is one of the great episodes, I think, of unintended consequences in our history. But if you look at the Port Huron statement, right, this original statement of young people trying to imagine a new left in 1962, you can see their diagnosis is that the political apparatus in America has too much similarity. You look at Barry Goldwater, who we're going to talk about in a moment, really the standard bearer of the conservative movement in the early 1960s, someone who publishes this book, Conscience of a Conservative, in 1960, says something very similar, which is that our voices can't be heard. The political parties are too much alike, though we conservatives are deeply persuaded that our society is ailing and know that conservatism holds the key to national salvation and feel sure that the country agrees with us. We seem unable to demonstrate this and to have a political vehicle that's going to realize that on a national scale. And so part of our story today is looking at what happens in the party system as a result of the 60s and 70s, but specifically looking at this story for the right and for the conservative movement. So in thinking about the conservative movement and where it came from, and this is its own designation, right? A self-conscious process of articulating certain ideas, forming certain coalitions that starts in the middle of the 20th century. We need to go back to the New Deal and to its many, many opponents. Friedrich Hayek is in the 1940s beginning to articulate some of the critique that's really going to become central in terms of a critique not only of socialism, but of concentrated power, of planning, of government ambition and intervention that have been so central to the politics of the New Deal and the war. We then see a lot of that critique channeled through the Red Scare and through McCarthyism, which we talked about a few weeks ago. And it's, I think, easy to forget in our standard narratives of McCarthyism that even at the moment that Joseph McCarthy was being censured, essentially driven out of American political life, not only by his liberal critics, but by his own party, by the Republican Party, he was still a pretty popular figure. He had many, many supporters, and this is just one hint of that. This is a demonstration in 1954 at the moment of McCarthy's censure in favor of all that he had done and all that he stood for. And so for many people who are on the right, consider themselves McCarthy's supporters, this moment of 1954 is actually a crisis that produces a kind of rethinking, the narrative being, here we had a hero, we had a champion who was doing what we needed and liked. And his censure shows to us that we have no place in the American political system, that American politics has been captured by liberalism, and we have to do something about it. One of the people who is central to that critique is this man here, William F. Buckley. Students in the class have encountered Buckley in possibly two ways at this point. The video for this week is William F. Buckley's debate with James Baldwin around the question of civil rights and racial justice that took place at Cambridge University, sort of like the YPU, in 1965. Yale is also the repository of William F. Buckley's papers, and it's an amazing collection for those of you who want to explore the conservative movement a little bit further. Buckley is a really important figure. He is from the state of Connecticut, grows up in a wealthy Catholic family, lives in Sharon, Connecticut for much of his life. He comes to Yale. He's a big man around campus, editor and chairman of the Yale Daily News, among other things. When he graduates from Yale in 1951, he ends up publishing his very first book, God and Man at Yale, which is a critique of his experiences here, and particularly his Yale professors as all a bunch of socialists. Thus setting in motion a grand historical tradition of Yale students getting a pretty good education and then going off and denouncing the university. Buckley's lesser-known second book is this one down here, McCarthy and His Enemies. And Buckley, as a kind of young anti-communist, trying to make his way in the intellectual world of the emerging right, writes this book in 1954, defending Joe McCarthy, saying you might not like all of his tactics, but his heart is in the right place, and the cause of McCarthyism was a good one. Now, that was pretty bad timing for a book defending McCarthy, but that sense of crisis and that impetus to really rethink what is going on, make some different intervention in American politics, becomes in many ways the cause of Buckley's life. In 1955, the year after McCarthy's censure, he founds a magazine called National Review. And National Review is very explicit about what it's trying to do. First of all, it wants to stop all of this stuff that has been happening, the growth of the federal government, in some ways the push for civil rights. And it has this famous mission statement as it's getting started that the purpose of National Review is to stand athwart history, yelling stop at a time when it seems that history is hurtling forward in only one direction. The other purpose, self-avowed, of National Review is to bring together the many competing factions of people who describe themselves in one way or another as conservative in this moment, but who often aren't talking to each other. And those three factions are really represented by three best-selling books of the late 40s into the early 50s. One you're familiar with, Friedrich Hayek, who is one of the people who helps to articulate a libertarian tradition, a free market tradition, a small government tradition. That is one piece of the story. The second is a book by an intellectual named Russell Kirk. And Russell Kirk is really, during these years, like many people, trying to develop a kind of intellectual apparatus for a traditionalist view of conservatism that is about going slow, that is about respecting established institutions, that in some ways has religious faith and hierarchy at its heart. And then the third is the anti-communists. And in fact, at National Review, many people who fit into the anti-communist camp were themselves former communists, like Whittaker Chambers, who actually ran a Soviet spy ring in the 1920s and 1930s before announcing that he was leaving the Communist Party and becoming really a key figure in this building coalition. The attempt to bring all of these groups together was known as fusionism, and in many ways it becomes the sort of overarching view, at least from the top, of what this new conservative movement was going to be and what it was going to stand for. National Review was always a relatively elite publication, small circulation, really about intellectuals, idea people, people deep in the scrum of politics, engaging with each other. But there are other more grassroots movements that begin during this years as well, in reaction to the downfall of Joe McCarthy and a concern that anti-communism was falling out of American life. One of those, probably the most important, one of those new grassroots institutions was the John Birch Society, just founded in 1958 to really build a national network at the grassroots around the cause of anti-communism, though, as you can see, the 1960s go on and the John Birch Society intervenes in other critiques of federal power, of protest culture, of civil rights, of the Supreme Court as the decade goes on. And the right developed its own student movement as well during these years. An organization called Young Americans for Freedom, founded almost at the same moment as Students for a Democratic Society that we saw last week. Young Americans for Freedom, like SDS, has chapters on many American campuses. It has lots of students who are joining, and it too puts out its own manifesto. It's worth noting the Port Huron statement is quite long. It's like 40 or 50 pages. The conservative students get together at Buckley's estate in Sharon, Connecticut, and deliver a much shorter and much more efficient statement, at the center of which is concern about the growth of the federal government, the future of what they describe as liberty or freedom, and the need to really be committed to anti-communism. Young Americans for Freedom, as the 60s goes on, begins to sort of have parallel demonstrations to the anti-war movement. These are photographs from a variety of pro-Vietnam, pro-war demonstrations that are staged by Young Americans for Freedom and others. But in a lot of ways, its model and its style of politics is really quite different from what emerges on the left. Young Americans for Freedom is very committed to the transformation of the Republican Party. And in particular, many of the early participants in Young Americans for Freedom really learn the political trade through the campaign of Barry Goldwater, who becomes the Republican candidate in 1964. As you can see here, Goldwater presents himself very much as a man of the West. He is from the state of Arizona. He's actually the heir to a department store fortune. He is not a cowboy in quite the way that this would suggest, but a lot of the energy in grassroots conservative politics, as well as in higher levels of politics in the Republican Party, is really coming out of this huge population flow that is heading into states like Arizona, the rest of the Southwest, and particularly places like Southern California and Orange County, which become big, big hotbeds of the John Birch Society and the movement more broadly. Barry Goldwater becomes the one of the candidates vying for the 1964 Republican nomination, which he's ultimately going to win. But it is a big battle in 1964, and the battle is really over the question of whether the Republican Party is going to commit to an avowedly conservative candidate like Barry Goldwater, or whether, as that sign over there suggests, championing other candidates, whether it wants to stay in the mainstream, stay in the Dwight Eisenhower tradition. And the most famous quote from Barry Goldwater's convention speech is what you see here, that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. So we're talking about a conservative movement that is beginning to come of age in 1964, really gets behind Goldwater, but it is itself a movement with lots of different factions, and the Republican Party is quite deeply split around these questions. Once Goldwater secures the nomination, he runs without pulling any punches about his point of view. One example is this quote here: "The good Lord raised this mighty republic to be a home for the brave and to flourish as the land of the free, not to stagnate in the swampland of collectivism, not to cringe before the bully of communism." Right? So he's really leaning into this set of themes. And in fact, In Conscience of a Conservative, which was ghostwritten by another Yale graduate, a man named Brent Bozell, Buckley's brother-in-law. He makes an even broader claim about the United States. He says, quote, "America is fundamentally a conservative nation. The preponderant judgment of the American people, especially of the young people, is that the radical or liberal approach has not worked and is not working." This is central to his campaign in 1964. But as it turns out, as we saw in 1964, America does not agree that it is fundamentally a conservative nation, at least not as far as Barry Goldwater is concerned. So 1964 is a huge national defeat, not only for Goldwater and the Republicans, but for some of the ambitions of this emerging movement. But there are two pieces of the 1964 campaign that nonetheless turn out to be very, very important over the long term. One is, as you can see here, Goldwater flips the South Republican for the first time basically in a century. This is going to be a trend that continues, but that is one of the most important things that happens in 1964, and it's a big deal at the time. The other is that the Goldwater campaign introduces to the national stage a figure who's going to be pretty important in this story, a young man, middle-aged man really, named Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan, at the moment that he comes forth backing Barry Goldwater, is already pretty well known to a lot of Americans. He's a Hollywood star. He's been deeply involved in kind of political debate in some way. But it's this moment, just a couple of weeks before the 1964 election, in which he delivers a televised broadcast in favor of Barry Goldwater that really puts him on the political map as a viable candidate and maybe the wave of the future for the movement. So I want to take 3 or 4 minutes here and watch Ronald Reagan's speech, just the very beginning of it. It's about a half-hour broadcast. Reagan himself referred back to this speech again and again as having articulated the basic ideas that he's going to hold throughout his political career. People within the movement and Reagan himself just referred to it as the speech. So this is the speech, and I think you'll see in watching Reagan some of the ideas and themes that we've already visited, but also the ones that are really going to shape the movement from this moment on.
The following pre-recorded political program is sponsored by TV for Goldwater Miller on behalf of Barry Goldwater, Republican candidate for President of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, we take pride in presenting a thoughtful address by Ronald Reagan. Mr. Reagan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you and good evening. The sponsor has been identified, but unlike most television programs, the performer hasn't been provided with a script. As a matter of fact, I have been permitted to choose my own words and discuss my own ideas regarding the choice that we face in the next few weeks. I have spent most of my life as a Democrat. I recently have seen fit to follow another course. I believe that the issues confronting us cross party lines. Now, one side in this campaign has been telling us that the issues of this election are the maintenance of peace and prosperity. The line has been used, we've never had it so good. But I have an uncomfortable feeling that this prosperity isn't something on which we can base our hopes for the future. No nation in history has ever survived a tax burden that reached a third of its national income. Today, 37 cents out of every dollar earned in this country is the tax collector's share. And yet our government continues to spend $17 million a day more than the government takes in. We haven't balanced our budget 28 out of the last 34 years. We've raised our debt limit 3 times in the last 12 months. And now our national debt is 1.5 times bigger than all the combined debts of all the nations of the world. We have $15 billion in gold in our treasury. We don't own an ounce. Foreign dollar claims are $27.3 billion. And we've just had announced that the dollar of 1939 will now purchase 45 cents in its total value. As for the peace that we would preserve, I wonder who among us would like to approach the wife or mother whose husband or son has died in South Vietnam and ask them if they think this is a peace that should be maintained indefinitely. Do they mean peace, or do they mean we just want to be left in peace? There can be no real peace while one American is dying someplace in the world for the rest of us. We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the Founding Fathers. Not too long ago, two friends of mine were talking to a Cuban refugee, a businessman who had escaped from Castro. And in the midst of his story, one of my friends turned to the other and said, "We don't know how lucky we are." And the Cuban stopped and said, "How lucky you are. I had some place to escape to." And in that sentence, he told us the entire story. If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves. You and I are told increasingly we have to choose between a left or right. Well, I'd like to suggest there is no such thing as a left or right. There's only an up or down. Man's old age dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism.
All right. So it goes on for half an hour. I would recommend watching the whole thing, but for right now, I just want to highlight a few themes that were there because they really become central claims for not only Reagan as a political figure, but for the conservative movement more broadly. One, the idea that all of this affluence, the New Deal, ultimately the Great Society, it's been built on a house of cards that's going to come crashing down, that prosperity is not what it looks like. The critique of planning that we saw in Hayek, but that is also being articulated as a kind of anti-elitist populist politics. That little intellectual elite in a far-off capital, do you want them planning your life or do you want to plan it yourself? And finally, anti-communism, really as the glue that is in many ways holding all of this together. We're going to come back to Reagan a little bit later in the lecture, but for the moment, I want to turn to a different figure, and that is Richard Nixon, because in the aftermath of Goldwater's defeat, as the 1968 election comes around, of course, the question comes up again. What is the identity of the Republican Party and who should be its standard bearer? And in this moment, Richard Nixon, who had in fact been the candidate in 1960, had lost, comes around again as a major figure. One of the things that makes that possible is the wave of politics, crises, confrontations that we talked about last Tuesday, the rise of protests on American campuses, especially the rise of urban uprisings, rebellions, riots that become really central and escalate very quickly over the course of the 1960s. Richard Nixon, when he was a candidate in 1960, was a pretty straightforward Eisenhower Republican. When he comes back in 1968, he comes back not only running around some of the themes that we heard Ronald Reagan articulating, but running against what he describes as the disorder, the conflict, the violence that is becoming endemic to American society. Nixon himself, like Goldwater and like Reagan, is from the West. He's born in Orange County. He is a pretty pure product of Southern California. He went and fought in the war and then was elected very quickly to Congress in the late 1940s and made his name by joining the House Committee on Un-American Activities, becoming the man who vanquished Alger Hiss, and thereby earning his place on Eisenhower's ticket as a very young vice presidential candidate, sort of Eisenhower's anti-communist pit bull, really his rival in some ways to Joe McCarthy. You can see him here in Moscow in 1959 at an exhibition, an expo that's being put on there, in which he has gone there as the great champion of American prosperity, of the American way of life, of the affluent society in that moment, as part of the country's Cold War strategy. He was on the ticket in 1960 running as around these themes of peace and prosperity, continuing the Eisenhower tradition, but he lost that election very narrowly to John Kennedy. And so the 1960s, in many ways, for Richard Nixon are periods of disappointment, of trying to rethink what a viable Republican coalition would be and also what he himself stands for. Runs for governor of California in 1962, loses that election as well. And it's a famous moment in which he says, "You won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore," at a press conference, and he's leaving politics forever. Well, fast forward, he does not leave politics forever, and in fact secures the 1968 Republican nomination, really running on the idea that the country had made a mistake in 1960, look what it had gotten, and this time you better vote like your whole world depended on it. He himself begins to embrace a much more aggressive platform that is centered around not only reaction to the civil rights movement, but a kind of law and order platform that centers protest and social disorder as the main theme of his campaign. I want to take a moment now and just show you two campaign commercials. They're both very short, and they really illustrate the difference between Republican politics in 1960 in the figure of Richard Nixon and how things look by 1968, the ways in which the whole political system is in conversation with each other but being transformed. So this is 1960, if it will play.
What is the most important issue confronting the American people in this election campaign? There's no question about the answer that I have found in traveling all over this nation. Above everything else, the American people want leaders who will keep the peace without surrender for America and the world. Henry Cabot Lodge and I have had the opportunity of serving with President Eisenhower in this cause for the last 7.5 years. We both know Mr. Khrushchev. We have sat opposite the conference table with him. We know what peace demands. We will keep America the strongest nation in the world, and we will couple that strength with firm diplomacy. No apologies, no regrets. Always willing to negotiate for peace, but never conceding anything without getting a concession in return.
Vote for Nixon and Lodge, November 8th.
All right, so that's 1960, professional management of the Cold War, foreign policy experience. Now we're going to watch a Nixon commercial from 1968. So we'll also give you a sense of how rapidly television is changing during these years.
It is time for an honest look at the problem of order in the United States. Dissent is a necessary ingredient of change. But in a system of government that provides for peaceful change, there is no cause that justifies resort to violence. let us recognize that the first civil right of every American is to be free from domestic violence. So I pledge to you, we shall have order in the United States.
All right, so very different themes, very different style. And in fact, in 1968, it's incredibly successful. So Nixon wins this time, wins relatively big. He wins in many places where the Republican Party has struggled before. Those yellow states down there, the states that Goldwater had won in 1964, flipped for George Wallace, the Southern segregationist, former governor of Alabama, who was running his own campaign. But as you can see, much of the country goes for Nixon. And because of Watergate, because we all know what comes later, I think it can be easy to underestimate just how significant that 1968 vote was. But at the time, there are many people who are looking at it and saying, this is the wave of the future. There is something new being born. It is a new Republican coalition, and it is going to be the wave of the future. The most famous statement of that is this book that comes out in 1969 called The Emerging Republican Majority, in which political strategist named Kevin Phillips declares the election of Richard Nixon bespoke the end of the New Deal Democratic hegemony and the beginning of a new era in American politics. The new popular majority is conservative, just as Barry Goldwater had claimed. Now, a lot of that book is devoted to trying to make an assessment of what the coalition is that's going to support this new conservative majority and send this emerging Republican majority to success in the future. And many of the constituencies that are being identified are constituencies that have been pulled out of the New Deal coalition, at least in their ambitions, and recentered in the Republican Party. So that includes the white South, which had been a bulwark of the Democratic Party, certainly during the New Deal, really reaching all the way back to the mid-19th century. We see that transition underway. The Sun Belt West, places like California, particularly Southern California, and Arizona, which are having huge population booms, these are going to be part of the story as well. And there's a group that Kevin Phillips refers to as, quote unquote, the New York City Irish. Now, what does he mean by that? He means urban ethnic voters, white ethnic working class voters who had once been really central to democratic political machines in northern cities and in industrial cities, particularly Catholics, now beginning to move into the Republican camp as well, and then white middle class suburbanites. The one group that he says, it's time to just let them go, are the northeastern states. He says they're going to go in a different direction, and anyway, they're losing population, and who needs them? And so after really decades in which places like New York had been bastions, New England as well, of a certain kind of northeastern republicanism, the death knell for that mode of politics is also being declared here. This turns out to be a pretty good prediction, at least as far as 1972 goes. 1972 for Richard Nixon is one of the great landslides in all of American history. Only one state does not go for Richard Nixon. That is the state of Massachusetts. And as you can see, people in Massachusetts were proud of that, particularly after Watergate. And that was a famous bumper sticker from the time, "Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts." Now, actually in office, Nixon turned out to be a much more interesting figure than his campaigning might suggest. He, in some ways, really governed as a big government liberal. For instance, the Environmental Protection Agency is created under the Nixon administration. Lots of women's rights laws. Title IX, I think, comes in then, though I'm not entirely sure. But he also, on the foreign policy stage, looks a lot like the Nixon of 1960, right? Trying to manage the Cold War from a kind of realist perspective, most famously opening diplomatic ties with China. Ultimately, of course, it is Watergate that comes to overshadow all of these, and one of the real tragedies, if you want to think about it that way, of Watergate is that a lot of it was precipitated by efforts to kind of manipulate the 1972 election to spy on the Democratic National Committee. That's the Watergate burglary. But as it turns out, they didn't really need to do that. It was a huge landslide and a big blowout anyway. Now, as the 1970s go on, with Watergate and other crises that begin to set in, that optimism of the early 60s that we talked about on Tuesday comes to be increasingly articulated as a set of problems and crises, that this is no longer a country on the rise, it's a country in decline. There are, of course, the stories about Watergate and its constitutional crises. As the 1970s goes on, economic crisis sets in, particularly growing inflation. A series of foreign policy crises set in. The oil embargo, the Iranian hostage crisis, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the American loss in the Vietnam War above all. And one of the things that this does is provide a new set of openings for other figures who want to make their bid on the national stage. One of those of the Democratic side is Jimmy Carter, who really comes to office vowing to be more trustworthy, vowing to be the anti-Nixon. But ultimately, many of these crises happen under Carter's watch, and so the 1980 election becomes something of a referendum on American life and politics as they look by the late 1970s. So I want to finish up in these last moments looking at the figure of Ronald Reagan as he is on the rise during these years. We saw him in 1964, but his path from that speech to the presidency 16 years later was in some ways a little bit uneven, even though he stuck with many of the ideas and themes he had been talking about. I am, now that I have finished more or less my road trip book, I am in the early stages of writing a biography of Ronald Reagan. And one of the things that really interests me about Reagan is the way in which his political story in the years before he becomes president really embody many of the key trends and ideas that we have been talking about thus far in this class. I should note, I did also visit the Reagan Library on my road trips. And you can sit on a horse and pretend to be riding with Ronald Reagan at his ranch. So this is me and my son, who was a teenager at the time. So he's there in that book as well. But what got me interested in thinking about him over this long scope of political history is, as I said, the ways that his evolution in some way mirrors the evolution of the country more broadly. He is a working class boy from Illinois who in the 1930s, in the midst of the Great Depression, sort of picks himself up, goes to Hollywood and says, "Make me a star," and they set about doing that. But so he really gets his start in the ferment of the 30s, but particularly in all of these new communications media that are coming into being. Hollywood in particular, portraying lots of great stock American characters, cowboys. There he is in Bedtime for Bonzo, which is a movie in which he's partnered with a chimpanzee. And once he was in politics, lots of people loved to make fun of him as the candidate of Bedtime for Bonzo. But so he learns very early on in his career how to negotiate the mediums of film and of television. He moves on from there to become the president of the Screen Actors Guild. So one of the great New Deal unions that's formed in the 1930s, but quickly turns against the leftists and particularly the communists within his unions. And the first moment that he really comes on the national stage is testifying in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and to some degree naming names of communists in Hollywood. From there, he goes on to leave Hollywood and become the spokesman for General Electric, really the great corporation that embodies the affluent society, consumer America. It's also while he's at GE that he begins to get some of his ideological education. GE is a famously anti-union company with very particular strategies around that. He is involved in the Goldwater campaign, but he's also involved in the movement more broadly, in conversation with many of the people and the groups that we were just talking about. And in 1966, he decides to take that moment and become the governor of California, running as an outsider, running as a conservative, and wins and serves 2 terms in California as governor. During his time there, he, like Richard Nixon, comes to articulate at least some of what he's doing as being in opposition to the sort of protest politics, the left politics, as well as liberalism more broadly. And California is a really important place for all of that in the 1960s. These are 2 events that happened during Ronald Reagan's tenure as governor. One is clashes over People's Park in Berkeley, in which protesters are trying to hold on to a park that has been used for gatherings and kind of community events, but as you can see, results in lots of violent clashes. The other is the moment when the Black Panthers march armed on the California State Capitol in order to protest a set of gun laws that were aimed at, in certain ways, stopping their activism against police brutality. So Reagan comes of age in the 50s, 60s conservative movement, and then really adapts himself, like Richard Nixon, to the politics of the 1960s. In 1976, he makes a bid for the Republican nomination, and like the battle at the Republican convention in 1964, this becomes a struggle over the fate of the Republican Party. Is it going to be Gerald Ford, the sitting president, considered by many Republicans to be a relative moderate, to be, quote, in the mainstream, as the Goldwater signs suggested, or is it going to be Ronald Reagan, an avowed conservative, and the person who says he's going to carry that cause forward? Reagan does not get the 1976 nomination, but he comes back around by 1980 with not only some of the themes that he's talked about already, but with a refashioned story about the United States and what has happened to it over these last 2 decades from his own point of view. A lot of what he ends up emphasizing is that the 60s and 70s have been tragedies for the country, that they have destabilized the social order, they have led to an unstable economy at the highest levels that was then seeing its realization in the 1970s. And so he calls for Americans to come together in a coalition that will somehow return the United States to an earlier moment in which the country was prosperous, stable, where the social order was functioning, and where values, as he would have suggested, are in place. This is an image that sort of captures that. This is Jerry Falwell out front, who is a Baptist minister, one of the organizers of religious right and Christian right that begins to emerge and backs Reagan very heavily in the late 1970s. Falwell creates an organization called the Moral Majority, and it is one of the vehicles for supporting Ronald Reagan. This language of majority, the emerging Republican majority, Nixon's silent majority, the moral majority, all of these are full of ambitions for not only winning one election, but in fact, transforming American politics in a much more permanent way. Reagan in 1980 comes up with a very powerful slogan that's intended to capture this historical story, that's intended to tell a tale about a past that was better than the present, but also a future that might be made as good as the past. That slogan was, "Let's make America great again." So it's actually in 1980 that slogan enters American politics. And I think as we think about that slogan, which might be familiar to a few of you, it's important to remember that it is telling a story about American history. It's a story about a lost past. It's a story about something that happens at some moment that corrupts American politics, identity, leads it to decline, and then its restoration to come. It proves to be really successful in 1980. When Richard Nixon left office in 1974 under the cloud of Watergate, many people said, the Republican Party is done for a generation because of the crises of the 70s, because of the political talents of a figure like Ronald Reagan, and because I think what Kevin Phillips noticed in the late 1960s, these broader changes in American society. Reagan wins in 1980. He wins even bigger in 1984, one of the other great blowouts of American history, in which he loses only one state. When we return after the break, which will be not next week, but the following Tuesday, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the politics of the 1980s themselves, what actually happens during that period. But for now, I want to finish off with a song that came out in 1984 in the midst of this election from a man named Bruce Springsteen. Born in the USA. One of the funny things about this song is that many people take it as this triumphal anthem about American life. If you listen to it, it's actually a very powerful protest song about some of the difficulties of life in the United States in the 1970s and 1980s. That's it.